The Manchester Man by Mrs. George Linnaeus Banks. Chapter 46. The Mower with his Scythe. Years went by. Lawrence had promised to remove Sarah Mustin, but the woman laughed, refused to stir, and he let her remain a thorn in his wife's side, training up the boy she had nursed, and whom he idolized, to scorn and jeer at his own mother, whilst her red-haired girl ran about the place wild as a young hare. He broke out from time to time, and his wife was the sufferer. He horsewhipped her, shot at her, and tortured her in every way that malignancy could devise. No wonder that so many tiny coffins of immature babes should be carried from the gates of the Fallowfield Grange. No wonder if Augusta began to compare her lot with Ellen's, and to repent her scorn of a true heart because of its plebeian origin. Meanwhile the firm of Ashton, Chadwick and Clegg prospered beyond expectation, the business tact and integrity of the junior partner alike aiding the extension and stability of the firm. To make way for its expansion, more warehouse room was required. The Ashtons, not without a sigh for old association, relinquished their house and removed to another close at hand in George Street, little less commodious, however much Kezia might grumble at it. This was when Ben Travis, lacking employment for time, mind and money, offered them to the growing establishment, and his influence as co was accepted. This combination of capital and energy, as Jabez had foreseen, worked wonders for them commercially, enabling them to tide over the trade distress of 1826 with security and advantage. Long before then Jabez had offered to pay Mrs. Clews her loan with interest, but she told him she was going to render up her account, where not the coin she had, but that which she had given away would be put to her credit. And so, as at first proposed, she made it over to her little godson, Joshua Clegg, before she was gathered to the great garner. But the universal moor reaped a heavier harvest in 1828, when he swept his keen scythe over the bed of the river. In 1822, Mr. Ashton, one of the first promoters of the Chamber of Commerce, notwithstanding his advancing years, took an active part in the formation of the new Quay Company for the better navigation of the River Irwell. The company was established, quays were constructed, warehouses erected, boats built, traffic was extended, and the town generally benefited. In the February of 1828, the axe, the adze, and the hammer made a busy noise in the boat-building yard of the company, and sailmakers were active with their needles, for a flat or barge, destined to convey cargoes of merchandise to and from Liverpool, was to be ready for the launch on the 26th, a day destined to send a thrill of horror tingling through the veins of Manchester, so sad was the catastrophe it closed upon. The launch of the Emma was an event in the annals of the company and of the town. Consequently a large number of spectators assembled, a goodly proportion being admitted to the yard to take part in the ceremony, and to go with the flat on her trial trip under Captain Gowdy. Mrs. Ashton, saying that when the cat's away the mice will play, had decided on remaining at home to watch the mice, but Mr. Ashton compensated himself by taking Ellen and her two elder boys, leaving baby with its grandma. Jabez, detained by business in the counting-house, promising to overtake them before they were on board. Mr. Aspinall too was there, and on his arm was his son's wife, and Lawrence, with his boy Willie, close behind them. He was too jealous of the admiration she excited to permit her to go into company even with his father, unless he had also his own eyes upon her, especially when there was a chance of meeting Jabez Clegg. He brought the boy for a treat. It was quite a gala day, and as the pleasant company mounted the deck, peered into the low cabin, and chatted gaily to one another, they little thought to how many that would be a launch into eternity. The boat, a large flat, fully rigged, painted white above the waterline and black below, with sails set and flags flying, rested in well-greased cradles, a head down. The shipwrights stood ready with their daggers, painters with their cans and brushes, to dab her sides as she slid past them. A band upon the quay played lively tunes, and, fatal mischance, the people on deck flocked to one side to listen. The sponsor, a Miss Grimes, who later married Abel Heywood, who was to be twice Lord Mayor of Manchester, and for many years the National Treasurer of the National Chartist Association, with her sister and friends, advanced to the bows. The word was given, the ready daggers struck away the shores, the boat began to move. Miss Grimes caught firmly the bottle suspended by a ribbon, and shattered it upon the vessel, proclaiming with that baptism of wine the boat was henceforth the Emma. Hurrahs and exclamations followed. The bows touched the water, which first splashed the faces, then lifted from their feet the christeners and the Ashton party. The flat had dipped too deeply. It heeled over on her crowded side and sank with her living cargo clinging and fettering each other in the swirling waters, while shrieking spectators looked on helpless from bridge and bank, watching others braver and bolder or better skilled rush to the rescue to their own risk. Who shall picture the horror and confusion of that moment when some scores of holiday people, men, women, children, were precipitated at one fell swoop into the water, shrieking and clinging to one another with that tenacity of grip proverbial with the drowning. The bridge, the old quay, the open space in front of the New Bailey prison, railed off at an elevation far above the stream, the steep steps and the towing path beneath were all lined with spectators, though the fatal launch was made from a yard lower down the river on the Manchester side, the New Bailey being in Salford. As the vessel struck the ground, shuddering from stem to stern before turning over on her side, and the final catastrophe was imminent, Lawrence, sober for once, snatched his darling boy up in his arms, whispered a hasty word of instruction and confidence, and regardless of aught besides, sprang with him into the water in the contrary direction, far as possible beyond the eddy and suction, and keeping clear of the struggling wretches who were pulling each other down, swam with him to the towing path. But not until he had placed Willie under safe charge, beyond danger from the scurrying throng, did he hasten back to attempt the rescue of wife or father, and then neither was to be seen. Mr. Aspinall had been an able swimmer in his day, and made a bold effort for self-preservation, but cramp seizing his gouty limbs, he was one of the first to disappear and perish, though boats and swimmers had put out to the general rescue. It was vain to search for individuals, though well was his son's prowess tested that day. More than one drowning wretch he clutched from behind by clothes or hair, and urged forward to the bank, where the Humane Society's men with ropes and grapples were ably seconded by volunteer humanity, and strong hands were outstretched to haul the helpless up. Ben Travis had waited for Jabez, detained in the warehouse by courtesy to Mr. Gregson, the buyer for Messrs. Leaf of London, and the two, hurrying to make up for lost time, only reached the New Quay with Nelson at their heels, as the hurrahs died out in appalling screams, and the waters of the Irwell closed over all the twain held dearest in life. With the celerity of light, coats were doffed and shoes cast off, and the two leaped from the stone quay in hope and dread. But the good old dog was before them, its teeth in a child's coat, swimming to the shore. Almost as Jabez touched the water, a sinking woman clutched his legs. With a plunge he freed himself, then, catching at her long hair, towed her behind him to the side, and swam back to seek and save his own wife and little ones, if that were possible. A floating scarf, a mass of matchless brown curls, a hand and arm above the water, and Jabez knew that Augusta Aspinall was sinking there before him. A few strokes brought him to the spot. He dived. A youth was clinging to her skirts and held her down. One or both must have drowned. With a blow which went to his heart, he freed her, and catching her beneath the armpit, held her well from him as he made for shore. To the Humane Society's men he yielded her. So far gone, the men shook their heads over the lovely woman, as though she were beyond help. But they bore the dripping lady to the sail-room close at hand, whilst Jabez, taking the precaution to secure a rope to his waist, plunged boldly into the midst of the entangled mass in quest of his own. It was a vain search. He brought one strange child, and then another to bank, and then a man, but he was again laid hold of when his strength was exhausted, and only for the precautionary rope he would have given to the greedy river the life Simon Clegg had saved from it. Travis had the good fortune to rescue Mr. Ashton, but he had been some time in the water, and the old man was far spent. But there was no trace of Ellen or her boys, even though he dived close by the sunken flat and brought up lifeless bodies in their stead. Jabez and he could only hope some other of the brave men, putting their own lives in peril, had saved them. The governor of the jail had opened his house doors. The recovered dead were carried into the jail itself. The sailmaker's room was crowded. Every tavern near was filled, but no trace was found of Ellen or their sons, and Jabez was like one distraught. He was but one agitated atom in that seething, surging, frantic crowd, where women shrieked for their husbands, parents for their children, children for their parents, where passing strangers threw themselves into the water to save life and lost their own, where ignorance lifted the hapless by the heels to pour the water out and extinguish the last spark of vitality, and where yelping dogs astray were caught and slaughtered, that medical skill might transfuse the warm blood of the lesser animal into the veins of the human, as a last resource to restore suspended animation. Even gallant old Nelson narrowly escaped falling a sacrifice to the surgeons. Jabez entered the room where Augusta Ashton was lying, to all appearance dead, ordinary means of resuscitation having failed, and a surgeon was about so to operate on her from a bleeding spaniel on the ground. Jabez shrank with a strange loathing, in an instant bared his arm to the doctor's lancet, and, if he did not give his life to serve her, as he had once said, he gave his life's blood to save her, and as the warm fluid passed from his quick veins to hers, he saw the blue quivering lids tremble, light pass into the brown eyes, breath part the blue lips once more, and from the depths of his anguished heart he thanked God as a faint Jabez indicated recognition as well as returning animation. He had restored a wife to thankless Aspinall, but who should restore to him the darling boys who had crept about his knees and round his heart, and the good wife who had won a place there in spite of fate by her own patient but intense love? The Emma was raised and floated, so little damaged that she was speedily ready for use, and continued so for many years. In her cabin were found the remains of Ellen and her sons, where the childish curiosity of the elder had doubtless led all three, but they were raised from the water only to be committed to the earth and covered up out of sight and hearing for evermore. And never did Jabez know fully all she had become to him until he stood with Travis by the side of an open grave and heard the clods rattle on the coffin lid. She was all as one then to the man who had worshipped her and the man she had worshipped, and though the babe she had left behind was nearer to the one, it would be hard to say to which little Nelly was the dearer in the after-time. Including the bodies found beneath the flat and those laid out in the jail and elsewhere for inquest, 33 lives were sacrificed on the altar of the Emma, and of these must be reckoned the brave men who cast their lives away to rescue others. Among the early saved were the captain, Miss Grimes, and her sister, the two latter being hastily conveyed home in a private carriage, mayhap Mr. Aspinall's, with coats and cloaks wrapped around their saturated garments. Good, kind, genial Mr. Ashton never recovered from the effects of his long immersion. He was a man far advanced in years, and the shock was too much for him. He hobbled about the warehouse, snuff-box in hand, a few months, and then dropped asleep in his easy chair after a game of cribbage with Jabez, never to wake again. And then the excitement and agitation consequent on the loss of his dear Ellen and her romping boys, having brought on Mr. Chadwick a fresh attack of paralysis, which left him still more helpless, though he survived many years to pet and spoil Ellen's baby girl. Mrs. Ashton, lonely in her large house, proposed that her sister's family, Jabez included, should join her in George Street, but when she would have said, "the more the merrier," the words died on her lips. Who were they but the survivors of 2 wrecked households? After a little hesitation the offer was accepted, and the whole family gathered in their shorn proportions under one roof. But there was another proposition from another quarter, to which there was considerably more demur. Mrs. Hume, in a warm grey duffel cloak for the preservation of her new mourning, travelled from Whaley Bridge to ask as a favour that baby Nelly should be committed to her care. "You see, Mrs. Chaddick, the poor little babby'll thrive better yon than here in smoke, and I'd fain do summat for Mr. Clegg. He have done so much for feyther and me." Jabez interrupted her. "Hush, Mrs. Hume. I owe life and all that life has given to your father and yourself. What little I have done in return has been but dust in the balance. Yet, as it is your desire, and I know baby will be best in your hands, if grandmother will consent to part with her, Nelly and her nurse shall go back with you for the coming summer months." And so, though parting with Ellen's baby seemed parting with Ellen over again, the little blossom went away to other blossoms on the healthy hillside. Tom Hume was no longer overlooker, but responsible manager at the Whaley Bridge mill, with a good salary, and if Jabez gratefully traced his fortune back to his cradle, so too did the Humes trace their amended position to the same source. But Bess more immediately referred to the benefits Simon Clegg had derived from the Buxton baths, whither Jabez had sent him year after year for the relief of his rheumatism, and to his care of steadfast little Sime. He had first placed the crippled lad with a doctor celebrated for his treatment of bodily deformities, under whom the boy's bent body had strengthened and straightened considerably, and then removed him for education to the house of a married clergyman, where there were no rough boys to torment him. Jabez knew well what were the amenities of public schools. Chapter 47. The Last Act. The catastrophe which deprived Lawrence Aspinall of a father, and had almost robbed him of a loving, patient wife, would have steadied any man less reckless and selfish than he. But that he should rescue strangers, and Jabez save his wife, and that through transfusion the blood of Jabez should course through Augusta's veins, formed a combination of mischances beyond parallel, and the honey was changed to gall. Nay, he was graceless enough to exclaim in the first burst of his jealous rage, "I would rather she had died outright than have that fellow triumph in her restoration through his means. Damn him!" And yet there were times when in his uxorious fondness he only persuaded himself, and half persuaded her, that his very extravagances arose from excess of love. His fancied wrongs culminated when first the will of his father, and after a brief period that of Augusta's father, were read and proved. The former set forth that, disgusted with the ungentlemanlike excesses of his son, and convinced that his course of lavish extravagance would end in penury, he had determined to settle on his son's wife, Augusta Aspinall, for her sole use and benefit, the house and premises on Hardwick Green, with all therein contained, together with a sufficient sum in the funds to maintain a befitting state. In the event of her decease, the reversion to pass to any child or children she had or might hereafter bear to his son Lawrence. To Lawrence he left the residue of his means, and the old business in Cannon Street, with a charge to apply himself to merchandise. The latter will, though equally stringent, was a much more prolix affair. After a number of legacies, of which Jabez came in for one, Mr. Ashton bequeathed to his wife all other properties whatsoever he died possessed of, together with half his share in the firm of Ashton, Chadwick, Clegg and Company, the other half to his beloved daughter, limiting the annual sum she was to draw from the firm, and which was in no wise to pass into the hands of her depraved husband, and Jabez Clegg and Benjamin Travers were appointed executors for the due performance of its provisions. Imagine the excitement and jealous fury of Lawrence Aspinall on thus being set aside even by his own father and superseded by his wife, and, as if that were not sufficient degradation, to have Jabez Clegg, whose charity school face yet bore the impress of his foot, set as his wife's executor to dole out what he called a pittance, where he had anticipated a fortune. It so happened that the early duties of his executorship called Jabez once or twice unexpectedly to Fallowfield, and that on each occasion the master of the mansion was from home. It might be that the river had washed the roses from Augusta's cheeks so effectually that her complexion had never regained its tone, or it might be that her skin looked white in contrast with the blackness of her bombazine and crape. Certain it was that Jabez was struck with the pallor of her countenance, and his inquiry, "Are you not well, Mrs. Aspinall?" was tinctured with alarm. As a light flush tinged her cheek, then faded away again, and she received him with a timid indecision very unlike her former girlish freedom, a sense of her almost supernal loveliness brought something of the old ache into his heart, and out of respect for himself and her, he hurried over his business, and having obtained the signatures for which he came, mounted his horse and rode back to town, haunted by look and voice and manner. Yet, in the integrity of his own heart, he had no conception that her embarrassment was the result of fear of the interpretation her jealous madman of a husband would put on so unwonted a visit. He thought he saw a smile of malice in the corners of the mouth of the bold woman who met him in the hall, and nodded to him so freely as he passed her on his way out, but no prescient spirit whispered in his ear that his 20 minutes' visit on absolute business would furnish envy and jealousy with a pretext for foul-mouthed slander, for coarse vituperation, for the use of a whip, and for calumnious accusations which cut deeper than its lash. Cicely, who intervened to save her mistress, might have conveyed some inkling of this to Mrs. Ashton, but Augusta absolutely forbade her sympathetic servant's interference. "You would do no good, Cicely," she said. "The evil is beyond earthly remedy. You would only distress my dear mother to no purpose, and she has suffered too much on my account already. It cannot last for ever." On the next occasion Jabez was accompanied by his joint executor, but even that fact did not save Augusta from her husband's wrath, and his vile aspersions went far to drive out the last lingering sentiment of affection or regard she had for him. But she clung to her child, and that bound her to her home, and him whom in an evil hour she had chosen, though tears fell bitterly on Willie's curly head, when he, like his father, gave her back blows for kisses, and if at times her conscience smote her for her haughty repulse of Jabez by the stair-foot window at Carr Cottage, what wonder? Had not Lawrence himself scored his rejected rival's name on her heart with his braces and whiplash? She shut the obtrusive memory out with a shudder, and dropping on her knees, prayed earnestly for strength to bear and to forbear. Yet much of the cruelty of Lawrence at this time arose from another source than causeless jealousy. He had been living far beyond his private means, and was greatly involved. He had calculated on laying his hands on a good round sum, and was disappointed. In order, however, to raise the needful, he sold his father's old established concern to their head clerk, far below its value. On the Fallowfield estate his friend Barrett held a mortgage, and, had it been possible, he would similarly have disposed of Augusta's possessions. Here, however, he was doubly baffled, and he turned on her as the primary cause. The old law, which preserved the woman's absolute right over properties legally settled upon herself, by strange anomaly, did not secure to her 1 guinea of the coin those properties produced. Well did Jabez watch over Augusta's interest, but his heart ached as he saw her sad countenance and the greedy, triumphant eyes of ever-present Lawrence when her dividends were paid in, for before his very face Lawrence laid his hand upon the money to squander it as he had squandered his own on Sarah Mostyn and other dissolute companions, leaving his wife without so much as would purchase a pocket-handkerchief. Then, lest she should make her wrongs known, he kept her a close prisoner at Fallowfield, and for all the pleasure she had of her Hardwick mansion, she might as well have been without it. No wonder if each fresh act of personal violence snapped some bond between them, until the only one link to bind her to life and her husband was her boy Willie, whilst the only human trait of Lawrence was his fondness for his son, whom he was rapidly ruining with false indulgence, as he himself had been ruined. It was customary, when the haymaking season came round, for Lawrence to gather such friends as his wife or he retained, the married with their children, for a frolic in the hayfields, and the bringing home the last waggon-load in triumph to crown or inaugurate a feast. On these occasions he had the grace, or the diplomacy, to keep Sarah Mostyn in the background, though she flaunted boldly enough about the house in the presence of his wife, and her child mingled with the children. The harvest home of 1831 was attended with the customary festivities. Willie, a rough playmate, was half smothering Nelly Clegg in the hay, or chasing the Walmsleys amongst the haycocks until the last load was ready, and then the boy insisted that he and his companions should be mounted atop. Shouts and cheers announced their coming to the party in the drawing-room. They came crowding to the windows, and the glass door being open, one or two sauntered out onto the flagged walk. Merrily they came along the gravelled drive under the hot sun, dreaming of no danger, Willie clapping his hands and calling, "Look at us, Papa!" when right in front of the drawing-room window the pin which held the body of the cart down by some means became displaced. The cart tilted up, and hay and children were sent flying. Beyond a few bruises, none of the children were injured but one. They had fallen amongst hay or on the spongy lawn, but Willie, the one jewel in the Aspinall casket, pitched with his head on the flagged pavement and was killed on the spot. Draw we the curtain over consternation and bereavement, and pass on to results. If a change came over Lawrence, it was not for the better. He drank incessantly, became alternately moody and defiant, and added a coping stone to his offences by placing Sarah Mostyn at his table by the side of his wife, and boldly avowing that her child was his child also. Then all the woman rose within Augusta, so long cowed and dispirited. She left the table, and, the insult being repeated, again retired in indignation. Of the servants none had pitied her so much as Cicely, but for whom communication with her friends had been cut off. Often had the former waxed savage over indignities she could neither check nor prevent, but in many little ways the faithful domestic was enabled to ameliorate the condition of her mistress, now that Mrs. Aspinall, more lovely in her sad womanhood than in her brilliant girlhood, was virtually supplanted, a prisoner under torture in her husband's house, with no tie of motherhood to bind her there. Her old nurse, as the mouthpiece of Mrs. Ashton and her Aunt Chadwick, had urged upon her once more the necessity for legal separation, and Augusta no longer turned a deaf ear. When Jabez came to hand over the next quarter's dividends, Travis accompanied him, and then Augusta, in the presence of both her executors, demanded and claimed her right to a legal separation from her husband. Lawrence, taken by surprise, started to his feet, then, resuming his seat, said with a scowl and a contemptuous sneer, "You had better obtain a divorce, madam, whilst you are about it. Mr. Clegg will not object to the costs, if you can only be made Mrs. Clegg by Act of Parliament." It was a cruel and uncalled-for sneer, and Travis, firing up, resented it for his friend, who appeared dumbfounded by the suggestion. "If she had been Mrs. Clegg, sir, instead of Mrs. Aspinall, there would have been no necessity now for the interference of friends for her protection," said Travis. "Of course not," sneered Aspinall. "Mr. Clegg is the white hen that never lays away, and now, having favoured you with one of Mrs. Ashton's pithy proverbs, perhaps, gentlemen, you will favour me by taking your departure. This house and this lady are alike my property." The value he set upon the latter article of property was testified by an immediate application of a horsewhip, so savagely applied that even Bob and Luke the gardener, drawn thither by Augusta's screams, wrenched the whip from him and covered her escape, the latter declaring he would no longer stay and witness such work. To this man, who was also gatekeeper, Cicely crept at nightfall, and offered him a goodly sum down out of her own savings, promising a much larger one from Mrs. Aspinall, with the offer of a new situation at Hardwick, if he would only suffer her ill-used mistress to get clear of that brute's violence. The man, to his credit be it told, refused the money, but opened the gate, and when Lawrence wakened from his sodden sleep at noon the next day, wife, cook, and gardener were missing. The three had walked to Hardwick, and once there, though Augusta found sad havoc had been made in the place, all was her own, carnage included, and the domestics in charge welcomed her with gladness. Without waiting for even the show of a breakfast, Augusta hurried like a frightened bird to her mother's nest in George Street, where alone she felt secure. Jabez and Travers were summoned, and when Aspinall, recovering from his stupor, sought his human property at Hardwick, he found the trustee under his father's will, a Mr. Lilly, holding the place for Augusta in right of his trust, and in George Street he was refused admission, Mrs. Ashton justifying her daughter's flight with, "Self-preservation is the first law of nature. A good jack makes a good Jill. 'Tis the last straw breaks the camel's back. If you sow the wind, you must reap the whirlwind. He who beats his friend makes an enemy." He threatened, and she answered, "Threatened folk live long. You had best, Mr. Aspinall, keep your breath to cool your porridge. Augusta's friends will defend her from her only enemy. Pending separation, you see her no more." He never saw her more. The deed of separation was sealed, but never signed. With Augusta, all good angels seemed to have flown from Fallowfield. In his demonic passion, he strove to blacken her character, to find himself met with laughter. His own life had been so chaste. Whilst, as if to refute him, when she took refuge with her mother, Jabez deemed it a point of honour to retreat. Accordingly, he took up his temporary abode with Travers, in delicacy towards her, and, as a check upon himself, no act or thought or word of his must give an evil tongue a chance to foul that spotless woman with its slime. In the midst of all this, Aspinall's embarrassments increased. Creditors pressed, writs showered in upon him, Barrett foreclosed, and men were put in possession of the Grange. He flew to his old remedy, and it drove him mad. Lancaster jail for debtors loomed upon him. From his chamber window he beheld a sheriff's officer approach with a warrant. His cavalry pistols were in his dressing room. A sharp report rang through the house. Lawrence Aspinall, in the prime of life, delirious with drink, driven to desperation by his own profligate excess, set a blood-red seal on the deed of separation. 10 years had passed from the partnership of Ashton, Chadwick and Clegg, years in which money well employed had multiplied itself. Jabez was a rich man, a man of influence in the town, no longer the amateur artist but the patron of art, as well Henry Liversidge and others could have told. As he had been one of the first promoters and directors of the Manchester Mechanics Institution, so was he now the supporter of the Royal Institution for the advancement of art, and seeing farther than Mr. Ashton, who was a member of the New Quay Navigation Company, had opposed the act for a railway between Manchester and Liverpool, he threw his energy into the project and helped to carry it out, his cousin Travis working with him. His widowerhood had cast a gloom over him for a time, but he left himself small leisure for morbid reflection, and that was cheered by the prattle of his little Nelly. Then came the crash at Fallowfield, and when darkness set upon Aspinall and his deeds, light broke upon the path of Jabez Clegg. At first a mere ray, but he worked the more cheerfully in its light. It was not hope for himself. It was merely a joyful consciousness that there was hope and calm in the sky over the head of their fluttering and wounded dove, and that Augusta could now rest in peace with her mother in the house at Hardwick, with no dread of a brutal husband bursting on them unawares. He came and went as friend and executor, but it was long before it flashed across his comprehension that the fearful ordeal through which Augusta had passed but brought his old master's daughter closer to him, or that the prayer old Simon had taught was being answered to the full. That which was above rubies had blessed his life and kept his human heart warm whilst his coast had enlarged. He had been kept from the evil of a wilful and capricious wife, and at last, when he had resigned all prospects of setting the purified pearl as a star on his own breast, it dropped into his hand, unsought, unsolicited. He had schooled his heart, we know. He had married from a sense of duty and grateful compassion. He was a faithful husband to a true wife, and when he lost her, he mourned her as a valued friend. But through all, the early love of his being had been kept alive and in a ferment by the sufferings of Augusta. As an honourable man, he suffered no word or look to betray more than a friend's sympathy, and still he kept a stronger guard over himself, though the tragic end of Lawrence had set her free once more. The last fatal act struck a sensitive chord in Augusta's nature. There was no exultation at release. For a time she lost sight of his profligacy and cruelty, and accused herself of having hastened the catastrophe by leaving him to his own unbridled will, and the temptress by his side. She wept for the handsome lover who had captivated her young fancy. She mourned for the besotted soul gone to its account with all the imperfections rampant. "Let her alone," said Mrs. Ashton to her sister. "The sharpest shower wears itself out soonest. She will come to her senses long before her crape is worn out." Mrs. Ashton was a true prophetess. For a long time the Fallowfield tragedy cast a shadow over the house at Hardwick, and they led very retired lives. Then harp and piano were heard once more, visitors were admitted, and the mansion that Kezia and Cicely united in declaring worse than a nunnery grew bright and cheerful, though the widow's weeds were not cast aside. Kitty had been laid under the mould, whilst Augusta was yet a bride. Almost 2 years had elapsed. Suitors in plenty had been attracted by the wealthy young widow's many charms, her old admirer Mr. Marsland among the rest. Yet Mrs. Aspinall showed no disposition to change her state, and the one man who had loved her longest and best was not of the number at her feet. He scorned to importune now in his widowerhood for the love withheld when they were both young. He counted age by events, not years. It was for Augusta now, she who had been taught by her very husband's taunts and sneers to think upon the true man she had set aside, to think of him daily and hourly with a rapidly strengthening attachment, and think of him as one who had dropped her from the book of his life for ever. Her whole thought was how could she become worthy the love of such a man. Yet every day and hour the fear pressed heavily upon her that the quiet virtues of Ellen had driven her out of his heart altogether. Of all her guests he was the one most welcome, most desired, but he was the one she received with most reserve, the one whose stay was briefest, whose visits fewest. Business appeared to have more imperative claims on him than when he had had his way to make, and Augusta, whose sables had long since been cast aside, seemed to wear them on her heart. The vivacity which had never wholly forsaken her in all her trials forsook her now. She grew listless and melancholy. Meanwhile Captain Richard Chadwick had come home on half pay to brighten up the somewhat dull house in George Street and comfort the old folk, to say nothing of astonishing Simon, Nelly, with his long yarns and adventures. Syme always spent part of his vacations with Mr. Clegg, who well paid back to Bess all her early care for him. He indulged the boy's craving for books and pencils, first implanted by himself, and in which he saw the dawn of his future career. That which in his own case had been repressed and subordinated to trade and money-making should not be so checked in that boy, and old Simon, to whom the lad appeared a marvel, never ceased to pride himself on his forecast in pronouncing Jabez a godsend. It was during the second summer of her widowhood, when Augusta accompanied her mother, not a whit the less stately than of yore, to our cottage for the first time since her attempted elopement, that the feeling of all she had cast from her, and all that she had brought upon herself, all that might have been, and now never would be, pressed heaviest upon her. She had gone thoughtfully over the old ground, had trod the nettle-grown lover's walk, and sat down on the open window-ledge at the stair-foot, as once before, and wept tears of penitent bitterness. How long she sat there she could not tell. She was weeping for a life lost and a love rejected. As once before, the voice of Jabez, whom she imagined 18 miles away, broke upon her solitude. But now it thrilled through her. There was a light touch upon her shoulder. Mrs. Aspinall? She shuddered. "Oh, don't call me by that name here," broke from her imploringly. "What name shall I call you by?" half wonderingly. Then, in a lower, semi-smothered tone of entreaty, "Augusta?" Lower sank her head in her hands, but there was no answer save her sobs. It was thus he had addressed her there once before, "Augusta," and this time the hand on her shoulder shook. "Augusta, dear Augusta, once on this very spot I found you weeping thus, and I begged to be allowed to share your grief. I told you I would give my life to serve you. What I said then I repeat now. I would give my life to serve you, and you know it." He gently drew one hand from her agitated face. "Tell me your trouble as you would tell it to a brother." A brother, ah, that was it. She drew her hand back, but she did not rise, and her sobs seemed to choke her. Again he took her hand, and his other arm went round her soothingly, protectingly. "Oh, Augusta, this is inexpressibly painful to me. I love you as never man loved woman. Can you not tell me what troubles you?" And the earnest tenderness of his voice made strange music in her ears. He had seated himself on the narrow window-ledge beside her, and now he thought she was about to punish his presumption and quit him haughtily as before. But no, she only slid from his arm to his very feet, and cried, with still-covered face, "Oh, Jabez, dear Jabez, forgive me all I made you suffer here, for oh, I have repented bitterly." He was stunned, bewildered. His passionate declaration of love was made as a claim to her confidence, not to her affection. And now, dear Jabez, did he hear aright? For an instant he was silent from very incapacity to speak. Her bent head touched his knees. Slowly, reverently, as if she had been a saint, with every nerve of his strong frame trembling with emotion, he raised her from the ground. But no arm went round her now. He held both her hands in his and looked steadfastly down upon her, but no answer made he to her plea for pardon. Constraint in voice and words was apparent and painful, but emotion grew too strong for control. "Augusta, what is the meaning of this? For God's sake, do not mislead me. I seem on the threshold of heaven or madness. Is it possible that I, plain Jabez Clegg, can be dear to you? Dearer than life?" Clear, full and earnest came the words from her soul. Clear and truthful were the eyes that now sought his. Thank God! He held her in his arms with a straining clasp, which told how long they had quivered to embrace her so. His eyes lit up with an intensity of love she knew not he could feel, and never had his lips met woman's in such fond kisses as he pressed on hers. The concentrated love of years seemed gathered to a focus then. Life of my life, he called her, and she knew and felt it was so. If the shade of the departed Ellen could have looked upon them there, remembering how she had rushed to his embrace in that very spot, and how different had been the kiss imprinted on her wifely brow, would she have reproached him? I think not. Is it needful to add that before the summer waned, the Manchester man, rapidly rising into public note and favour, entered into another partnership, or that Jabez Clegg, in right of Augusta his wife, took possession of the mansion at Hardwick, to the satisfaction of Mrs. Ashton, who said, "Better late than never," or to tell how the trade of Ashton, Chadwick, Clegg, and Company continued to extend, or that Travis remained company to the end of the chapter, the children's company never taking a wife unto himself. Postscript by Malc Cowle. I first came across the Manchester man in my paternal grandfather's bookcase in the 1950s. I must have been about 11 or 12 at the time. I was being brought up by my dad's unmarried sisters, Beatty and Dolly Cowle. Like my grandfather, born in 1879, and Isabella Varley, that is, Mrs. George Linnaeus Banks, they took great pride in Manchester and its people's struggles during its rise from a small insignificant village in the southeast of the Salford 100 to the world's first industrial city, the town of Long Chimneys. By the late 1830s, cotton textile goods were known as Manchester cloth on every inhabited continent, and the town was the epicentre of the struggles of working people to combine and form trade unions and cooperatives, for parliamentary reform and universal suffrage, for the right to assembly, for a free press and free speech, for women's rights and public education. In short, all the rights we now take for granted in a modern parliamentary democracy. In many respects it is a pity Mrs. Banks brought her tale to an end in 1832. This, of course, was the year of the Great Reform Act, known amongst Manchester and Salford's working people as the Great Betrayal. For whilst that Act of Parliament ended the landed aristocracy's monopoly control of government, it only extended the vote to a few thousand upper-middle-class manufacturing and merchant capitalists, denying the franchise to those who had fought hardest to achieve it, namely sections of the lower middle class and the working class. I say it is a pity, because it would have been interesting to see how she envisaged Jabez Clegg's development over the next decade. These were the years when the working class was coming of age in many ways. Denied the right to vote, they eventually formed the Chartist movement to continue the struggle for universal suffrage commenced by the Blanketeers and the participants in the great demonstration on St. Peter's Fields in 1819. The Chartist movement first burst into the light of public knowledge in the great mass demonstration, the Monster Meeting, as it was called, on Kersal Moor, above the old Manchester racecourse in 1838. Would Jabez Clegg, in his new role as a manufacturer, have followed the lead of the Todmorden mill owner, John Fielding, a man whose first-hand knowledge of the textile industry and the barbarities it inflicted on working men, women, and children led him to address that first meeting and to throw himself into the campaign for parliamentary reform, the 10 Hours Bill, and for legislation restricting the hours worked by women and children in particular, and protecting their rights? Would Jabez have followed his example, or would he have forgotten his own roots and become a typical money-grubbing exponent of laissez-faire capitalism, like the vast majority of mill owners and their political representatives in the Whig Party and later the Liberal Party? Alas, Mrs. Banks chose to leave such questions unanswered, so we can only speculate, although she did marry a man active in Liberal politics. When I first read the book, I viewed it as a stirring yarn, documenting the history of a foundling's rise from misfortune and poverty to prosperity and happiness. Little did I know the long-term impact it would have on my own thinking once I commenced my apprenticeship as an engineer, and in turn became involved in working class politics, and, much later in life, as a writer of historical fiction. Mrs. George Linnaeus Banks, née Isabella Varley, was born above her parents' shop on Oldham Street in the centre of Manchester on the 25th of March 1821. Her father, James Varley, was a pharmacist. He, along with his wife Amelia, took an active part in politics in the period before the Great Reform Act, when Manchester was denied any parliamentary representation. He subsequently served as a town councillor, alderman and magistrate. Isabella was brought up on tales of the town struggles, related by relatives and friends around the fireside of an evening. They had first-hand knowledge of the infamous Peterloo massacre, which had taken place within half a mile of her home, less than 2 years before her birth. Such tales fueled her interest in Manchester's history, its people, and her own work as a writer. She published her first set of poems in 1844 under the title of Ivy Leaves, although an earlier poem, A Dying Girl to Her Mother, had been published when she was barely 16 years of age by the Manchester Guardian. She authored a number of books, including Bond Slaves, A Story of Struggle, dealing with the earliest period of the Industrial Revolution and the campaigns of the Luddites, although The Manchester Man is her best-known novel. I trust you, dear reader, will have enjoyed this work as much as I did when I first came across it, all those many years ago. But bear in mind, although it claims to be a work of fiction, this book is peppered with a great deal of historical fact. Malc Cowle, Manchester, 2012. For more information on Mrs. George Linnaeus Banks and of the works of the narrator, go to www.malcspooks.com. There you will find not only The Manchester Man, but 2 other books written by Isabella Varley. Please support the work of the Working Class Movement Library in Manchester's twin city of Salford. I think I am correct in saying it is the largest collection of working class literature and information going back to the very beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, not only in Britain but in Europe. There is a link to the Working Class Movement Library website on malcspooks.com.